All right, so rounding would have been what we did. I'm gonna do this one first, I think. Wednesday. So Wednesday we did rounding to the nearest tenth, the nearest hundredth, and then the nearest whole number. So now we're going to look at the different types of questions that they can ask us when it comes to rounding. So typically if I would have been here, I would have let you just try this paper and then we would have gone through it, but it still would have ended up being glued in anyways. So because I'm not here, I'm just going to go through, and all I'm really asking you to do is just be with me. If I write it down, I want you to write it down. If I highlight it, I want you to highlight it. If I box it in, I want you to box it in, because after this video, you're going to do some questions that look a lot like this paper, and I want to make sure you have everything you need to be successful. So number one is saying, what is 3 and 149 when rounded to the nearest hundredth? First and foremost, when they tell you what place value they want you to round to, I want you to get in the habit of boxing it in. If it's on the computer, I want you to get in the habit of highlighting it so I know that your brain sees it. When we practiced rounding on Wednesday, I told you to find the place value and circle the digit. If they're asking about the hundredths place, I'm going to circle the digit in the hundredths place, which for me right now is a 4. You're going to move to the right and you're going to underline that next number. I'm going to write up top just for me that a 0 through 4 means your circle stays the same. 5 through 9 means that you're going to add 1 to it. So because this underlined number is 9, that means I'm going to add 1 to the 4. Anything that's in front of your circle stays, which means the 3 stays, the decimal stays in the same spot, the 1 stays. That 9 is going to bump that 4 up to a 5. So I have 3 and 15 hundredths. If you were somebody that was adding that 0, that's fine. If it's behind the circle, it turns to a 0. Otherwise, leave it. You don't need it. There's nothing there. 2 is asking you to take that number and round to the nearest whole number. Because it's on paper, I'm asking you to box it in. If it would be on the computer, I'd be asking you to highlight it so that I know your brain sees it. The whole number is everything in front of the decimal point. So it's not just the 9, it's the whole 19. You're going to find the place value and circle the digit. You're going to move to the right and underline it. That next digit is a 9. 0 through 4, your circle stays the same. 5 through 9, you're going to add 1. If I add 1 to 19, I'm up to 20. So that's what my number would be if I rounded to the nearest whole number. If you want to throw a decimal point behind 20, same number. You want to put a 0 behind the decimal point, same number. You want to put a 0 in the tenths, hundredths, and thousandths, same number. That 0 is nothing. Number 3 is asking you to take that number and round to the nearest tenth. There is already a 4 in the tenths place. You're going to find the place value and circle the digit. You're going to move to the right and underline it. A 0 through 4, your circle stays the same. 5 through 9, you're going up by 1. 3 falls between 0 and 4, which means that 4 stays. Anything in front of your circle stays. Decimal stays in the same spot. That 3 leaves me alone, which means that 4 stays a 4. If you want to add a 0 behind it, you're more than welcome to, but you don't need it. 4, 5, and 6 matter because they say select all, which means that if you do not find everything that you need, they will mark it wrong. So I'm going to ask you for 4, 5, and 6 to highlight the bolded select all for me. I'm also going to highlight on number 4 where it says tenth, because that tells me what place value I need to start at. 4 asks you to select all the numbers that round to 4 and 5 tenths when rounded to the nearest tenth. This lets me know where I'm starting. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to circle every digit that is in the tenths place. I'm going to move to the right of my circles and I'm going to underline the next digit. So I'm underlining 8, 9, the 0, the 5, I have another 0, and an 8. If the underlined digit is a 0 through 4, my circle stays the same. If it's a 5 through a 9, my circle goes up by 1. This 8 is 5 through 9. It's going to bump me up. And when it bumps me up, that 5 is going to turn into a 6. This 9 would bump me up. Everything in front of that circle stays. That 4 bumps up to a 5. That 0 leaves me alone, which means everything in front of the circle stays. That 5 stays a 5. This 1 also leaves me alone because it's a 0 through 4, which means that everything in front of the circle stays. That 5 stays a 5. This 0 would leave me alone, which means everything in front of the circle stays, but that 4 is staying a 4. This 8 would bump me up, which means everything in front of the circle stays. That 4 bumps up to a 5. 4 asked you to find everything that would round to 4 5/10, which means the second option works. The third option works. The fourth option works. The last option works. The hard thing about select alls is they don't have to tell you how many to pick. So you got to try everything and just see what works. 5 was also a select all, and it asks you to select everything that would round to 9 56/100 when rounded to the nearest hundredth. That word hundredth matters because it lets me know what place value I'm going to start in. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to circle every digit that's already in the hundredth place. I'm going to move to the right and I'm going to underline my next number. So I'm underlining 7, 8, 1, 0, 9, and 8. If my underlined digit is a 0 through 4, then my circle stays the same. If it is between 5 and 9, my circle's going up by 1. This 7 is going to bump me up, so I'm going to put a little +1 up there. Anything in front of the circle stays. I'm going to keep the 9. I'm going to keep the decimal in its right spot. I'm going to keep the 5. That 7's going to bump the circled 5 up to a 6. This 8 would also bump me up. Anything in front of my circle stays. 9 stays, decimal point stays, 5 stays. That 8 bumps my 6 up to a 7. This 1 is between 0 and 4. It's going to leave me alone, which means that 6 will stay a 6. This 0 would also leave me alone, which means that that 5, that circled 5, would stay a 5. This 9 is going to bump me up. Anything in front of that circle will stay. That 9 will bump that 5 up to a 6. This 8 bumps me up. Anything in front of my circle stays. That 8 bumps my 5 up to a 6. 5 asked you to find everything that would round to 9 56/100, which means the first one works. Second one doesn't work because that 8 bumped my 6 up to a 7. They don't want a 7, they want a 6. Third one works. This one does not work because it has a 5. They want a 6. The last two both work. It's anything that's going to get you 9 56/100. 6 asks you for anything that would round to 11 when you are rounding to the nearest whole number. Whole number means when you go to circle that place value, you're circling everything that's in front of the decimal point. So I'm circling all of 10. When you move to the right and you underline the next digit, you're underlining whatever digit is going to fall in the 10th place. So for the first one, I'm going to underline a 9. Then I'm going to underline 0. I have a 4. I have a 6. I have a 3. And I have a 4 in the last number. If your underlined digit is a 0 through 4, then your circled number stays the same. If it's a 5 through 9, then you're going up by 1. This 9 is going to bump that 10 up to an 11. That 0 is going to leave me alone, which means that 10 stays as 10. That 4 would leave me alone, so that 10 stays as 10. That 6 is going to bump me up, and it's going to bump me up to an 11. That 3 is going to leave me alone. That 10 stays as 10. That 4 leaves me alone, and that 10 stays as 10. 6 wanted anything that got you 11, and there were only 2. Can you please mark the first one? Can you please mark the fourth one? Nothing else is working. 7 asks you to select the value of each decimal number when it is rounded to the nearest whole number. I want you to highlight whole number for me because it lets you know what place value you're starting at. The problem with the chart, and a couple of you had this on PM1, was you would have maybe one of them correct, but if any of them are on, or sorry, I was talking to Miss Sadat, was saying something to me and I wasn't paying attention. If any of them are wrong, they mark the whole thing wrong, and that sucks. So when you circle whole number, you're circling everything in front of the decimal point. So I'm circling the 5s. When you move to the right and you underline it, you're underlining just the digit in the 10ths place. If your underlined digit is a 0 through 4, then your circle stays the same. This 0 leaves me alone, so that stays as 5. That 5 would bump me up, and if it bumps up, then I'm going to bump up to 6. That 9 would bump me up, and if it bumps me up, then that 5 bumps up to a 6. That 4 is going to leave me alone, and that 5 will stay a 5. 8's a little bit different, and 8 might be something that we work on too when I come back, because there's more than one answer that will work here. They're asking us to create a number. So it says numbers are rounded to the nearest 10th and 100th as shown in the table below. Create the table to show the numbers that could be rounded, which means they want us to build a number for them, and that number has to round to 1 5/10, but it also would have to round to 1 55/100. So what I always tell my kids would be, I need you to see if what you have works, which means start with what's in the 100ths place. If I round this to the nearest 10th, I circle the 5 in the 10ths place, and I underline the next digit. I know that this cannot be where I start because this 5 would bump that 5 up to a 6, and they don't want it to round to 1 5/10, or sorry, 1 6/10. They want 1 5/10. But that automatically tells my brain that instead of me putting a 5 in the 100ths place, I'm going to go down and I'm going to put a 4. This by itself would round to 1 5/10 because that 4 would keep that 5 a 5. We need one more digit in the thousandths place because this part already works. That's going to make sure that we end up with a 5 in the 100ths place when we round, which means I would need a digit in the thousandths place that would bump that 4 up to the 5 that they want. So a 0 through 4, your number stays the same. 5 through 9, you would bump that 4 up. So that means you could put a 5 here. You could also have put a 6. 6 would bump you up. 7 would bump you up. 8 could bump you up. 9 could bump you up. So we're going to have to make sure that we have these because these could be an easy point for you. You just have to find what works. When you look at the next one, start with what's already in the column for the 100ths place. If I was to round 3 18/100ths to the nearest 10th, I know that that 8 would bump my 1 up to a 2, which tells me that this already works. So I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to keep 3 18/100ths, which means that I just need a digit in the thousandths place is going to keep that 8 an 8. 0 through 4, your number stays the same, which means you could put a 0 here. You could also put a 1, or a 2, or a 3, or a 4. Any of those options would keep that 8 and 8. You're going to start with what you already have in the column for the hundredths place. If I round 6 and 29 hundredths to the nearest tenth, that 9 would bump that 2 up to a 3. So that already works. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to keep what they already started with. It already worked. Which means we just need one more digit in the thousandths place that's going to keep that 9 a 9. 0 through 4, your number stays the same, which means you could just plug in a 0 there. You could have also plugged in a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4. Any of those would leave that 9 alone. Last one on here for this, if I round 2 and 14 hundredths to the nearest tenth, that 4 would leave me alone. 0 through 4, your number stays the same, which means this already works. So I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to keep what they already have. And then we just need a number that keeps that 4 a 4. So you could use 0, but you could also use 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. 9 and 10 are pretty similar. They're practice questions that say, Alice rounded the number 7 and 389 thousandths, and the result was 7 and 4 tenths. That is a decimal. That is a period. To which place value did she round the original number? If you can read this number correctly, you can find the place value. That says 7 and 4 tenths. But because that 4 is in the tenths place, that tells me everything I need to know. C is the only one that says tenth. So it's C. 10 says Ben rounded the number 15 and 812 thousandths to the and the result was 15 and 81 hundredths. To which place value did he round the original number? If you can read that number correctly, this is a decimal point, that is a period. That is 15 and 81 hundredths. B is the only one that mentions the hundredths place. So 10 is B. There is one more paper. Still different types of rounding questions. Okay, so it says round 29 and 834 thousandths to the nearest whole number. I'm going to highlight that just so I know that you see it. Identify between which two whole numbers 29 and 834 thousandths lies on a number line. So two parts. First thing we're going to do is round to the nearest whole number. So I'm going to take that number, 29 and 834 thousandths. If I round to the nearest whole number, I'm going to circle everything that comes before the decimal point. So for right now, it's 29. When you move to the right and you underline it, that 8 tells me that I need to bump up by 1. If I bump up by 1, that means when I round, that would round to 30. That 8 would bump 29 up to 30. The second part of this says, what two whole numbers would this number be between? The whole number is already 29. So that's my first number. When you're counting, the next number after 29 would typically be 30. So it would be between 29 and 30. Whatever the whole number is, it's that number, and whatever number would normally come after it. The next one is the same number. It asks you to round to the nearest tenth. And then it says identify between what 2/10 or which 2/10, 29 and 834 thousandths lies on a number line. So the first thing we're going to do is take that number and we're going to round. If they want the nearest tenth, that tells you what place value to start in. That 3 is going to leave me alone, which tells me that when I round, that 8 is going to stay an 8. So everything in front of the circle stays, decimal stays, that 8 stays an 8. They're asking which 2/10 would 29 and 834 thousandths fall between. Well, they're still looking at the tenths. This is already an 8 in the tenths place. So I'm going to keep that 8 in the tenths place. I would typically ask you what comes after 8, and most of you would tell me 9. It's whatever number is already there, and whatever number would typically come after it. Same number, except now they're asking me to round 29 and 834 thousandths to the nearest hundredth. They also want you to identify which 2/100ths that number would lie on a number line. So I'm going to take that number, and if they want me to round to the nearest hundredth, I'm going to start by circling the digit in the hundredths place. I'm going to move to the right and underline it. That 4 tells me that it's going to leave me alone, which means when I round, anything in front of the circle stays. 29 stays, the decimal point stays, the 8 stays. That 4 tells me that that 3 stays a 3. They want to know which 2/100ths it would be between. I already have a 3 in the hundredths place, which tells me that I'm going to keep a 3 in the hundredths place. I would ask you what number would come after 3, and pretty much all of you would tell me 4. So I'm going to put 29 and 83 hundredths and 29 and 84 hundredths. The next thing down says, which of the following are true about the number 104 and 29 thousandths? A says that number rounded to the nearest whole number is 4. Well, I'm going to ask you to highlight where it asks you to round to the whole number. But when you round to the whole number, it's not just the first thing in front of the decimal point, it's everything in front of the decimal point. So it's not going to round to 4 because I have 104 in front of the decimal. B also mentions the whole number. If I circle everything in front of the decimal point and I underline what's in the tenths place, that 0 leaves me alone. So B does work. B says rounded to the nearest whole number, it's 104. That is true. C asks me about the nearest tenth. I think there should only be one because it doesn't say, but I'm going to try it anyways. There's a 0 in the tenths place. That 2 would leave me alone, so that 0 would stay a 0. That's not a 0. That's a 2 in the tenths place, so that's not true. That doesn't work. Rounded to the nearest hundredth, there is a 2 in the hundredths place. That 9 would bump my 2 up, and it would bump my 2 up to a 3. This does not say 3, so that does not work. So even though it doesn't say it, E also works. It doesn't ask you to select 2. It doesn't say numbers, or which, it just says which of the following, maybe because it's are true instead of is true. Regardless, E also works. They're asking you to take that number and also round to the nearest hundredth. But there is a 2 already in the hundredths place, and that 9 is going to bump your 2 up to a 3, and that's exactly what that says. Same thing here. Okay, so at this point, you have a full piece of paper, and this would be cut in half, so you only have this part. I'm going to ask you to take the full piece of paper that you have and fold that in half for me. you're going to glue this on the very next page that you have. And I'm going to ask you to label this as rounding, decimals, practice. You can throw the date on here. It should be 22. Mine's not cut in half, but yours would be. So instead of you folding this, I'm going to ask that you just glue it sideways on the second page in your notebook. So this is on the first blank. This is on the second blank. You don't have to fold this. Fold this and label this, glue this in. Just glue this in so that it fits. And then you're doing an exit ticket for me.